Hello, my name is Zana, and in 2026, I finished my thesis film, Family Tree. It is the story of the relationship between Marjan and her grandmother and the grief that follows in her passing and how they remain interconnected after. I wanted to share how I came up with the idea and a little bit of the process in case it could help anyone working on or wanting to work on their own indie or student film. My thesis project was the main deliverable of the 4th year of my university. In my 3rd year, I made my first ever short film called Under the Dome. I went into this year knowing there was quite a few things I wanted to do differently. Our thesis process was laid out over 2 semesters, and the prompt was we could make anything we wanted as long as it was just little connected to our illustration and animation major. Over the first semester, we speed ran coming up with concepts and ideas and fleshing them out to a certain extent. While coming up with the ideas was fun and really pushed me in a good way, I struggled with connecting to my ideas at a level that was deep enough for what I wanted to do. I kept asking myself, is this really something I want to make, or is it enough of an idea that I could do justice to? And the answer, repeatedly and frustratingly, was always no. The last and most vulnerable idea I came up with at the end of the semester was the one that resonated with me the most. It was about my relationship with my grandmother, a sentiment that I thought about a lot. The general idea was about the similarities within family and how those connections are almost uncanny. I began documenting things that may have helped me flesh out my idea. I still had no idea what I was going to do or what message I was trying to send. The first part of fleshing out my idea was exploration and concept art. I began making a family tree made of portraits of my family. I never finished it, but that's between you and me. I then proceeded to character design. I kept in mind the essentials of shape language and color psychology when I made my characters and had to redesign my characters multiple times to get a coherent and fitting look. I did my best to create characters that fit together and also look like they belong in the wholesome narrative I was leaning towards. The concept art was where my animation started to take shape. I had this idea of my main character looking at the camera through an aquarium, and it reminded me of the Chinese restaurant we would always go to growing up and how important that restaurant was to my family, so much so that it was even my grandmother's last meal. It made me think more about tradition and the evolution of culture and what it means to me, which ended up shaping the narrative of my film. I then began doing rough boards or beat boards, which just gives a very general idea of the events of my animation, and also started working on the script. I really struggled with the end of my narrative. I wasn't sure how to conclude the movie, but I trusted the story and tried to follow its natural progression. This is where the second semester began. It was August and we had to finish and display our animations sometime in the beginning of December. Storyboarding was challenging but also fun, and it came hand in hand with the animatic. I was doing them both together, which most wouldn't recommend, but that was just what worked for me. Because I had full creative freedom of the camera angles, I tried to make it dynamic and interesting. At this phase of development, the rule of thirds was my best friend. I also tried thinking of angles which were different, whether they were inside things, diagonal, using a golden ratio, or any compositional tools I could think of. I should also mention that all the steps from storyboard all the way to color were done in Krita, which is a great software for digital art and it's also free. The next step was the rough animation, where we had to add most of the actual movement. Something that helped me was focusing on the keyframes and the shapes behind the figures. This is also where I added my first scratch track, which is a rough layer of sound. Sound completely changed the video, and it really helped me view my animation from a more finished lens. I was having a hard time deciding whether I wanted my animation to be in English or Urdu, but after some heavy pondering, I decided to settle on Urdu because it made most sense with the story of my animation and my characters. At this point, I was also starting to get a little frustrated. I was working on my animation all the time, but it really felt like I was making no progress. Every shot had so many frames and so many components that a lot of the time it felt like a whole day of work was spent doing something the eye really can't see. I also wasn't able to find a good enough place to work at university, so I was doing most of the work at home in complete isolation. And long story short, it was really starting to affect me mentally. But of course, things take time, and I just kept chugging along. It was very overwhelming to know where to start finalizing the short film, so my sanctuary was backgrounds. I loved the process of doing these. They were fun and so intuitive, and I could include as many Easter eggs as my heart desired. I also learned something brand new to me that really changed the way my animation felt, and that was compositing. I used Adobe After Effects and pretty basic effects to make my animation look a lot warmer and more cinematic. The process was super fun for me, and even though there was a bit of a learning curve, once I got the basics down, I was zooming through it. I learned most of the basics through this one YouTube video I'll link in the description, but you also just have to mess around and find out what works for you and your animation. Another thing that's super important that I had to do was sound. While I was recording, my mother, my sister, and I recorded in a quiet room and my phone mic. Sure to put a towel over the actor's head. And after editing, I think it turned out pretty decent. Me and my friends also had an animating sleepover where we recorded the rest of the voiceovers, but we didn't use the towel this time. And even though we used a better mic, you can definitely tell. So I would say use a towel. And again, I refer to another YouTube video, which I will link down below, that made my dialogue sound 100 times better. We also recorded all the background audio when we went out to eat or just sitting around the house and talking. At this point, we were nearing the end of the animation. So to recap, step by step, for every shot I animated, then I added the basic color to my frames, and then I composited them. I also put them on the editing timeline as I finished them. And that is something I really recommend just to keep yourself feeling like you have some momentum and to save yourself a lot of headache at the end. I also added the mouth movements of the talking characters closer to the end so I could get it just right with the timing and then adjust it a little bit on Premiere while I was editing. And that is how it ended. It was so surreal being done and being able to show the animation to everyone. At the end of the day, I'm really quite happy with how it came out. Of course, there are always going to be things that I want to change and do better, but I think I did the best for what abilities I have at this point. Hopefully, I'm going to continue animating in the future now that I've graduated and make something else this year. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you have any questions about anything at all. I will also be making more videos regarding animation and bettering myself as an animator in the future. So if that's something that you're interested in, please subscribe and I'll see you later. Thank you. Bye.